right. This is going to be a great discussion. I'm a little partial here. I just want to introduce our distinguished panelists. Joining me here on stage, we've got Representative Rob Whitman of Virginia, 1st District. We've got Jim Taiclet, the Chairman, President, and CEO of Lockheed Martin. We've got Dr. Derek Tournier, Director of Space Development Agency, and General Michael Gutlein, the Vice Chief of Space Operations for the U.S. Space Force. So, gentlemen, it's an honor and a privilege to have you here on stage. Thank you. And I think, honestly, I'm just going to kick it off, maybe just get a few comments from you to start this discussion about this very topic, securing the high ground, how well we're securing it, what you're watching in terms of this topic as space becomes an increasingly critical warfighting domain.
Well, listen, space has changed immeasurably here just in the last 5 years. If you look at what the Chinese have done, what the Russians have done in advancing capability there, think about that. If you combine Russia, China, and our other adversaries like North Korea and Iran, over 1,000 constellations in space. They are serious about making sure that they take over this domain. They're also fielding very aggressive capabilities in space, many anti-satellite capabilities, things that should really put us on notice. And we know, too, that the modernization of our military is going to be based upon what we're able to do in space. You look at communications, command and control, it is going to go through space. GPS is going to go through space. How do we create kill webs? That is layering. It's going to be in space. So the challenges are many. The opportunities are many. I argue that we have a great time in this nation's history to really take where we have been throughout the time, and that is advancing what we do best, our innovation and creative skills, to make sure we counter our adversaries. And listen, we've got our work cut out for us, but I want to give the Space Development Agency credit, want to give the private sector credit. We wouldn't be where we are today, folks, without incredible companies that do a lot, both in the launch business, in the constellation business. If it wasn't for that private investment, we wouldn't be where we are today. Space Force has done an incredible job. I think it's really important to understand, what decisions the Congress has made in putting those capabilities in place. So listen, I think that we are up for the challenge. But let's not undersell what the challenge is. It's incredibly deep, but I am confident that we are up for that.
And I think industry's role in all this, Morgan, is to array and marshal all the talent and all the expertise we have in our country, whether it's small startup, Lockheed Martin, Northrop Grumman, Boeing, mid-sized companies, and both in the physical Newtonian space, satellites, rockets, etc. Also the digital space, because if there's digital competition and perhaps active activities against each other by adversaries, we're going to have to defend ourselves as much with digital capabilities as we are with physical capabilities. So what I mean by that is cyber domain. Yeah. The cyber risk to space assets is great in that domain as it is in any other. Yeah. We want to be able to spoof the spoofers and get ahead and stay ahead of them with digital. That means we're going to have to look at non-traditional companies in addition to traditional companies. So, for example, we're pulling together with our company some small defense-oriented companies and some tech companies ways to make an architecture we call 5G.mil, which allows satellite, direct-to-terrestrial communications to the handset without needing a terrestrial network to do that. And so we're going to have to use all kinds of companies like Verizon as a partner of ours, IBM as a partner of ours, Intel to make specialized chips as a partner of ours. And so if you want to have joint all-domain operations, it's essential that you link those assets in a way that's resilient, multipath, and invulnerable to whether it's physical damage or cyber or digital damage.
I want to get into that more, but first, just to keep on going down the row here and get initial comments, and then we'll start digging into details.
Well, I thought Jim was going to say the role of industry was to deliver on our SDA contracts, but since she didn't say that, I'm just hoping that that's going fine. But no, so let's talk about securing space and why it's important. So let's talk about what space is used for, right? So space is used to make sure that we can maintain our way of life that we're used to now. Everything relies on space. And from our perspective in this forum, we're talking about national defense, it's also the way we project power. So if we have to have a fight, we can make sure that we win an away fight. You can't do that without space. Yeah. So in Space Development Agency in particular, we're focused on that second aspect more. Space Force as general, which Space Development Agency is a part of. Space Force in general has a larger mission. It has to not only protect the space assets and bring the fight to space, but also be able to project the forces that enable us to win. That's what Space Development Agency focuses on. The other aspect of that, I'll let the general talk about. But from our perspective, we have two main capabilities when we want to deliver. Beyond line of sight, targeting for moving systems. So we're talking about ships, we're talking about mobile missile launchers, we're talking about aircraft. Detect them, track them, calculate a firing solution, and send that directly down to the warfighter, and do that all in real time, all from space. Second capability is very similar, but there's a nuance. Do the exact same thing, detect, track, calculate a firing solution, and send it down to an interceptor, but now the targets are advanced hypersonic glide vehicles or advanced missiles in flight. Do that all in real time. So we want to make sure at SDA that we provide those capabilities, and we do it in a resilient manner by following two pillars. Pillar number one is proliferation. Hundreds and hundreds of satellites in low Earth orbit. You can actually secure and get a lot of resilience just from that proliferation, and that's how we do it. Pillar number two is the way we do it quickly so that we can make sure that we stay ahead of the threat is to use spiral development, which means every 2 years, by hook or by crook, we're going to get new capabilities fielded and operational so the warfighter can use them. So if you take those two pillars, proliferation and spiral development, that's how we get our resilience. So then if you start to pull that thread, I'm going to pull on what you said, Jim. Okay, so I'm not worried about things that can affect our systems on a 1v1 type thing, but there are two threats out there that I am really worried about. They're common mode failure threats. Number one is cyber. If we have a cyber vulnerability, it doesn't matter whether I have 2 satellites or 2,000 satellites, we could be vulnerable to that. So it is a big deal. We take a lot of protections against that. We do a lot of red teaming to make sure we ensure that. The second one is supply chain. Supply chain, the ability to actually produce these satellites at scale, and then supply chain interdiction. Obviously, if you're going to put these satellites together and you want them to be resilient, you have to make sure that you know the pieces and parts that you're buying are the pieces and parts that you ordered. So that's another area that we need our industry partners as well as in the government to make sure that we have assurance for the provenance of those parts. That's how we get resilience. And that whole mission is to make sure that we can provide those two capabilities. Beyond line of sight targeting, to take the fight forward, and then the ability to detect, track, and defeat missiles in flight.
So let me start from a different direction, because when I get done talking, I'm probably going to scare the heck out of you guys. You today have the world's greatest space force carved out of the world's greatest air force, protecting and defending your space capabilities. And you should be extremely proud. There's 9,400 Guardians on the front lines today doing the military work. Today, when we talk about securing the high ground, there is a capability gap between the United States and our adversaries that's about like this. And today, that capability gap is in our favor. The adversary is quickly shrinking that gap. And we have got to change the way we approach space pretty rapidly to make sure that that gap doesn't continue to shrink, go to zero, or in a worst case, go negative on us. Because if it goes negative on us, it's going to be a really bad day. Because as Derek said, we rely on space for everything in our day-to-day lives, as well as the way we fight as a joint force. Without space, you cannot get crops out of the field. You cannot get gas at the gas pumps. You can't get groceries. You can't get ambulances to the emergency or fire trucks to the fire. There will be a very bad day without space, and we have to prevent that. And that's what your Guardians are doing every single day. But when you ask what we're seeing, and the congressman kind of talked about it, is we're seeing a new steady state set of behaviors that we haven't seen in the past. The adversary has become very emboldened to mess with our space capabilities. They've become very capable, and they've become very intent on their ability to deny our ability to use space. A couple years ago, there was a gentleman's agreement. You didn't mess with each other's space systems. Just flat out didn't. Today, it is the norm. It is a normal behavior to jam GPS, to spoof GPS, to jam SATCOM, to cyber attack, to fly UAVs over CONUS. That new behavior, that new norm of behavior is very unsafe and unprofessional, and it could cause major strategic problems if we don't rapidly get after it and start really investing in our space capabilities.
How do you get after it? And I ask that knowing that there's the anti-satellite technology out there. You're hearing about snatcher satellites that can kill other satellites in orbit. I mean, just 2 days ago, the New York Times publishes another op-ed focused on nukes in space and what Russia's been doing over the last couple of years. So when you talk about that capability gap shrinking, what does that look like, and how secure is our critical infrastructure in space, or not?
Today it is secure. Today it is effective. Today that capability gap is in our favor. We used to believe as a DoD that we had to own and operate our own kit. We believed that for many different reasons. First and foremost, we didn't believe we could count on our commercial partners and international partners to be there during times of crisis or conflict. Therefore, I had to own my own kit. The second reason was I had the most exquisite kit on the planet, and I didn't need to rely on anybody else. The third reason was I didn't want to paint a target on our allies or on our commercial partners. That has completely changed. Russia has come out in the press and said anybody operating in space is a target. Anybody operating in space is a target. Civil, commercial, NASA, allies, you are all targets. You couple that with the fact that we have the biggest area of responsibility with the smallest force and the smallest budget, we have to change the way we get after the fight. The way we are changing the way we get after the fight is through partnerships. Partnerships with allies and partnerships with commercial by integrating and networking those capabilities together into hybrid architectures. That is something that we are changing that we don't do in the other domains. Yeah. It is something that we are doing it by necessity in space because it is so big and so under-resourced. We're also doing it by necessity in space because we need our partners to be by our side as thinking adversaries.
And of course, Space Force is, 5 years old this month, I believe, right?
On the 19th.
So happy birthday.
Thank you.
But also, I mean, the Space Force, maybe because it is young, it is small, it is agile, has been leaning in on things like public-private partnerships and thinking differently about acquisitions and engaging with commercial space. I don't know about anybody else, but I've spent this whole weekend doging, like having conversations about Doge and conversations about acquisition reform and cutting costs and what it's going to look like with an incoming administration, et cetera, et cetera. So, Congressman, I'll go back to you and ask the question, when we think about the intersection of commercial space and national security space, civil space, space infrastructure and architecture, is this an example of something that is actually working in the DoD?
It is. Listen, we see the things that are happening out there. We look at states that are getting into this business. Take, for example, Virginia, the Virginia Spaceport Authority. Think about it in the Pacific and Alaska, the Virginia, or there, the Pacific Spaceport Authority. So people are all in to say that we need to do this. This is an across-government enterprise, and people understand, we know the strategic importance of space, but we also know the commercial importance in space. And as has been pointed out here, it used to be that those were parallel tracks, but they were in different lanes. Today, they are parallel tracks in the same lane. We know that both of those have to be done concurrently. We know protecting those space assets are going to have to be done as a joint enterprise. We know, too, that technology development is going to occur simultaneously in the private sector and the public sector. If we look at efficiencies, the best use of resources, you see what's happening right now. Look at what's happening in the constellation business. Look at the partners that are there. Look at SpaceX and others that are really driving the technology in that space. Look at the companies, too, that are in the launch platform businesses. Multiple companies that are doing incredible work. And it's amazing to me. We're at a point in time where the excitement, and I remember when I was a kid, I remember staying up at night watching Neil Armstrong step foot on the moon. That was the most exciting thing to me ever. I watched a launch platform be recovered on a space pad there and to come down and get captured. Man, if that doesn't excite you, then you don't have blood flowing through your veins. That's what's happening today. This is a re-energizing of the space enterprise, and it's happening because there's this jointness between the government, the private sector, in utilizing resources, and we haven't seen that in the history of this nation, I think, almost ever. It's an exciting time, great capabilities here. It is a great example about how you leverage the innovation and creation on the private side with government as an enterprise and the things that are necessary strategically, but leverage the investment that's taking place there golly day, I don't remember a time where we've seen this and where there's such incredible potential there that's going to really put this nation forward. And just as General Gutlein said, we need that because we see what our adversaries are doing. The one good thing about this is our adversaries do not have the creative and innovative ability that this nation has across the spectrum. We will win in this space, but I can tell you, it will be a competition. And it's an all-hands-on-deck moment. We have to make sure we are up for this competition.
Dr. Tournier, I want to get your thoughts on this because as we do talk about budgets, I realize that's the jurisdiction of Congress, but this is in focus, right? We talk, and you do talk about the strategy at SDA. We know space is hard. If you have a flatlining or even potentially declining budget, can you do and get everything that you need to see the strategy through?
Let's talk about efficiency, and then we'll let the budgets work their way out. So from an efficiency perspective, so if you look at it and you say, okay, how can you make acquisition in space more efficient, right? And so that has been that is why the Space Development Agency was originally created, to be able to go faster and more efficient than traditional space. Traditional space was done at a time, I was mentioned, where essentially there was a gentleman's agreement where you could put up an exquisite system and you didn't really have to worry about it. We're not in that time anymore, so we need to be able to put up systems up there, put them rapidly for resilient, and be able to have continually refreshed. The way we get efficiency at SDA, and the way we measure efficiency, as was mentioned at the breakfast panel today, is that you can't really, you can't count anything unless you can measure it, and then you can start to put metrics against it. In an acquisition organization, in the government, right? The government, we don't really build anything. We don't really do anything. We yell at performers to do things and give them money to do things. So one of the metrics that we use at the Space Development Agency is dollars executed to get a capability delivered divided by the total number of employees and contractors that we have at the agency. For us, that turns out to be about $14 million out the door per SDA employee, including military, civilian, and contractors. That's about a factor of 10 greater than a lot of acquisition organizations. And the reason we're able to do that is because we're not trying to do the most exquisite. We really are relying on what is commercially available and modifying that as minimally as possible and getting it out the door as quickly as possible. That's how we're able to turn these from order to orbit on the order of 30 months, because we're able to do that because we look at what industry is doing as a commercial entity, what they're building, and we say, okay, look, we don't want them to build more than that. We want to just slightly modify that and get those cranked out as quickly as possible. And that's how we do it. And the model, I'm going to completely butcher Congressman Whitman's a quote that he had recently, but hopefully I'll get the gist across.
There you go. Yeah.
So the gist was essentially, he said that, look, we are in a digital infrastructure, digital age. We need to start thinking about things more digitally and less hardware focused.
Yeah.
And the reason that's important is we look at our hardware the same way. We don't look at our hardware starting from scratch on time one and then going to version 2 and moving forward. We do this spiral development model where we do small modifications and new releases every 2 years, just like software. You know, if we want to get that down to every 1 year, we'll keep pushing, but right now it's 2 years. And that's kind of this model. We want to treat hardware as software because it's all about a digital ecosystem now.
This notion that Congressman Whitman brought up between the relationship between industry, broadly speaking, and government really urgently needs to be evolved. Yes. It needs to change systemically. Because again, we want to include as many companies, as many sizes of companies as we can in the solution development that you all need. The way that we're starting to look at it at our company is to take a mission or an app, so to speak. And the app would be space resiliency. And we start with time equals 0. Yep. What's out there today? So General Gutlein's nuclear launch sensing satellites are pretty much all up in geosynchronous orbit now. They work. They're safe now. But how do we make that app, sensing the launch of nuclear missiles against our country, better every, say, 3 to 6 months even, not even 2 years. So every 3 to 6 months using a combination of digital and physical upgrades interrupted at times by a whole new system, a whole new platform. And so we would think about are all the ways we can, as industry and government, working together quickly with a rapid acquisition process along with it, to say, you know what, if we can change the waveform on that satellite when it transmits instructions back and forth to the ground station and have a low probability of intercept and low probability of detect waveform in that signal, that's going to make us another leap forward in resiliency. And it's something we can probably do over the air in 3 months. And so those are the kind of things that we need to think about. And that's why you heard me talk about companies that you don't think would normally have hardly anything to do with national defense, because the waveform creators in 5G are going to be Nokia, which is Finnish, and we have a partnership with them now, and they're in NATO as well, and other companies in that space. And so they are not familiar to the Pentagon, nor is the Pentagon familiar with them, but it's industry's responsibility to find the solutions on that technology roadmap and implement them in a way that government can absorb them. And that's going to require fairly dramatic change on some of the processes between government and industry.
So what does that mean in terms of how you're thinking about the portfolio at Lockheed Martin? I mean, when we talk about space specifically, obviously the space economy, the industry, it's changed so dramatically in the last 5-10 years, continues to change. I know just earlier this year you acquired Terran Orbital, which is manufacturing satellite buses. So how do you decide what to try and stand up and be more competitive with in-house versus partner on? And how are you thinking about this changing landscape with so many competitors and startups, including some that are in this room right now?
So our T-X time, we are the exquisite satellite provider to Air Force, Space Force. A lot of it up in GEO, some in the mid-orbits. And we have an amazing facility in Sunnyvale that I'm afraid no one can really get into here, but a few of us. And it does amazing things using that sort of architecture. Geosynchronous, a lot of capability, like literally billion-dollar platforms that can do things that you can't imagine. We also need to be able to do those things at different orbits, with different numbers of satellites, with different resiliency protections among them, so that we can't lose all in one swoop our ability to detect missile launches.
Right.
Another key strategic capability, and I'll use that as my example of how are we changing to make this better, is in communications, especially strategic command and control communications, which are, again, incredibly essential. The president has to be able to get to Stratcom and provide instructions through the secretary. So that is a critical task, typically also done with large, very well-protected satellites in high orbits. But now we're augmenting that, along with MDA, to go into lower orbits. There's a transport layer and a tracking layer now to get low Earth orbit satellites in the game in those critical missions. And to do that, you've got to have Space Force expertise, you have to have MDA expertise, you've got to have, frankly, our expertise and a couple of the other companies that traditionally do this. And then we bring in the newer companies, the Terran Orbitals, to enable us to ramp up our small bus production satellite. We bought that company, but at the same time, we're building a 150 satellite per year internal factory in Colorado to do the same thing. So, and then thirdly, we've partnered with other small satellite bus makers, and some of them large, like Eutelsat. So we're figuring out how do we merge into the commercial industry in a way that will make our customer better off and actually more efficient along the way. So that's some of the things that we're doing, Morgan.
If I can add to that, what Jim is talking about is the foundation of CASR, the Commercially Augmented Space Reserve, and that is key in what we need going forward. General Gutlein has laid out the things that are potential in that space. We have a number of companies that are out there that put up some pretty incredible constellations. You talk about LEOs, MEOs, low Earth orbit, mid Earth orbit, GEOs. That all has to be part of that. How do we leverage all those assets? How do we leverage those companies that are doing work in a lot of different spaces there? You do it through the Commercially Augmented Space Reserve Program. You make sure that you are using all those particular assets. And we are indeed in a time when software is going to direct hardware. All of our hardware is going to be software informed. So the key is how do we do that? And it can't just be limited to the constellations. We have to be able to look at that and make sure it includes launch vehicles. We have to make sure that our reserve is there to where, if called upon, tomorrow we could launch constellations on a launch vehicle and make sure we respond at the speed of relevance if somebody uses those extraordinary means to take down those space assets, which are going to be key. That's going to be the foundation, folks, of how things operate. Command and control, JADC2 as it's called, Joint Command and Control, is going to have a space element to it. You look at what we do with GPS, all those things are linked to space. We see an even more aggressive behavior by our adversaries. Our contingency is to have a CASR program that is broad and that has the assets necessary to where if there's a threat, we're ready for that. And just as Jim said, to make sure we're using every piece of talent that's out there. So those folks that are really good in the software realm, we're working with those folks that are really good in the hardware realm, and all of a sudden we come up with technology that's vastly better than anybody else's out there. I'm excited about how we can leverage all those opportunities in this nation and maintain our advantage in space. Our adversaries are not going to step aside. You look at what they're doing as a counter to what they know we're going to do to get ahead of them in the tech realm. What are they doing? They're looking to hold at risk our space assets. I argue our technology is going to help us mitigate that risk and actually keep us ahead of the threat.
General Gutlein, I want to get your thoughts on this. How quickly can you get what you need?
Pretty quick. There's a lot of excess capacity and innovation coming out of the commercial market today that we are working really, really hard to take advantage of. When you started talking about, hey, what are you going to do if you start losing resources or the budget starts to go down or what have you, we're going to rely on partnerships.
Yeah.
Those partnerships are to bring that capability to the table under a concept that we call exploit, buy, build. We are trying to have a culture shift in our acquisition community that takes advantage of everything and anything that we already have on orbit in new and innovative ways. Exploit what we have. If I can't exploit what I have, then go buy it. If it exists out in the wild, go buy it from wherever it is. And only build the capability at the end if we absolutely must. That's going to allow us to go faster. It's going to allow us to do it cheaper. But with the support of Congressman Whitman under the Commercially Augmented Space Reserve, that concept is going to get us the capacity we need during times of crisis or conflict that I cannot afford during times of peacetime. And what you don't want to wait is to start building that relationship with commercial after the balloon goes up. You really want to start doing it during times of peacetime. So by building that partnership today at a very low cost during peacetime, I will have access to that capacity during times of crisis or conflict. Those are the ways that we are trying with very limited resources, very limited budget within the Space Force to get after what is an enormous amount of demand signal coming out of the nation and out of the Joint Force.
Do you feel like you have enough launch capability to do all of this? And I ask that knowing that you've been contracting, but we have a number of companies out there that are developing rockets. They maybe haven't flown yet,
Right.
or they've been delayed. And it's gone from a situation where 10 years ago you had SpaceX fighting just to be able to put a bid in on a contract to now dominating the launch market. So do you feel like the competitive landscape to be able to get stuff to space is robust enough?
We come at it from two different ways. One is the launch ranges. So the Cape in Florida, Vandenberg in California, the Virginia spaceport, the Alaska spaceport. That's it. We're out. That's our 4 launch sites within the United States. We have maxed out that capacity. We are launching as many rockets as fast as we possibly can from those launch ports. We must expand the range capacity. We must diversify the range capacity to make it more resilient. That's one aspect. The second one is, do we have the launch providers to build that capacity? Today we do. And there's more coming online behind it that are building out more capacity behind that. So I think we're on a good path for launch providers, but we've got to expand our launch complexes.
Dr. Turnier, I want to get your thoughts on supply chain. Solid rocket motors, Jim, I have a feeling you have thoughts on this too, but solid rocket motors, when we start talking about missiles, missile defense, we start talking about hypersonics, it's been a topic for a number of years now. Certainly, I'm hearing about it again this weekend as well. Do we have enough? When you start thinking about what you need for missile defenses, for example, how do you bring more online, and where's the bottleneck? How do you fix it?
for us, for proliferation, right, supply chain is the biggest issue. And it's interesting because if you look, we're a few months away from launching our Tranche 1 satellites, first operational tranche, about 160 satellites next year, be operational, be able to provide global capability for tactical data links, as well as the missile warning, missile tracking mission. But right now, we have 27 satellites on orbit. Those are our Tranche 0 satellites, demonstration satellites. Those satellites were built during COVID. They launched about 7 months late for the first one. And the reason they launched late was because of supply chain. It was during COVID where everything was shut down, and the supply chain problem there was we couldn't even buy resistors. I mean, it was different. We couldn't buy toilet paper, right? So resistors are more difficult than that. So that's what caused the problem. So now in Tranche 1, we're going to launch late again, probably about another 7 months compared to where we originally planned. You say, well, what caused that? It was supply chain again, but different problems in the supply chain. We can buy resistors all day long now, but there's a difference between being able to manufacture an optical terminal or a reaction wheel on the order of single digits versus being able to ramp that up to where I need 100 of them. And obviously, people were a little optimistic in how long it would take them to ramp up their manufacturing lines. And we pushed them. We pushed them pretty strongly on that. And they've now ramped up. I will say that what we're seeing, supply chain in the small LEO system market has caught up to what SDA's needs are. But it took them about 8 months longer than they anticipated to ramp up. And so we see that now we're kind of caught up. But that demand is going to continue to increase, and it's one of those areas where it's very difficult from a business proposition because you can't put a lot of capital in before you get the investment up to get the ramp up, and so you've just got to plan for that. And so one of the ways we plan for that is we tried to pull our solicitations in to give industry a little more time to ramp up their production. But supply chain is always going to be a problem. It's always going to cause delays. But I want to put out a statement that a lot of people forget. Even though it takes a while to get the hardware and the supply chain built up to actually build the satellites, it doesn't matter what you see on the schedule on day one. I'll tell you right now, critical path is always software. Software is always on your critical path, mostly because you can't start a lot of the software until you have some of the hardware, but that's one of the key things. So let's not fool ourselves. Supply chain is not only supply chain in the hardware and being able to build things, but we also need a robust industrial base that can create software, test software, get the software ready to go, and build that capability up. Right now, our industrial base relies a lot on foreign entities to write our software. It's one of the things that we've kind of said we're worried about that at the Space Development Agency. We want our flight software and our satellites to be written in the U.S. Because that's one of the supply chain interdiction things that I'm worried about. And so that's been a bottleneck. So I want to get people to think about that, and I want people to also stop thinking about the defense industrial base. We don't look at the defense industrial base. We look at the entire industrial base. And by the way, if you happen to do defense as part of that industrial base, more power to you. But we want to leverage the commercial side of that, hardware and software, because those are both critical.
Morgan, if I can build on that for a second. Derek right now is, for the lack of better terms, the canary in the coal mine right now. Because of the quantities that he's ordering, he's now starting to uncover the challenges that we have with the industrial base. And these challenges are significant, and we need to figure out how to get after them. You heard Senator McConnell today at lunch bring it up. We've got to start thinking our way through this. We have spent decades optimizing our industrial base for efficiency and consolidating, and we are single suppliers deep across multiple different fronts. All you got to do is look at what Derek's experiencing or what we saw with the 105 rounds because of what we're sending into Ukraine. We do not have the industrial capacity built today to get after this. And we're going to have to start getting comfortable with lack of efficiency in the industrial base to start getting excess capacity so that we have something to go to in times of crisis or conflict.
Jim, I have to get your thoughts on this.
Yeah. So solid rocket motor is a really good example. And what General Gutlein is referring to, we call in our company the anti-fragility effect. So there's a book by Nassim Taleb who wrote The Black Swan called Anti-Fragility, not as well known as a book, but it really applies to this problem. So the theory of anti-fragility means that any natural or human-designed system, if it's disrupted, tends to weaken or fail. And if you can build in resiliency to that system ahead of disruptions, then you will have a more reliable system.
Yeah.
But there's a cost to that. There is a cost to excess capacity. There is a cost to ordering parts, 3 years worth of parts in case there's disruption.
Which is not efficient.
2 years, it's not efficient, and there's a cost to it. But the cost, based on a risk-adjusted basis, is minor. Because as in the Ukraine situation, I would do a real quick sideline here. Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff asked me a month after it started, how fast can you triple the production rate of Javelin missiles? And I told him 3 to 4 years, and I found out I was underestimated.
Yeah.
We are not able to scale. We are very vulnerable to small numbers of key suppliers. So now back to the solid rocket motors. There was the consolidation down to 2 solid rocket motor providers, Aerojet Rocketdyne, which was acquired by L3 Harris, and secondly, Northrop Grumman has a unit, orbital ATK, that does it. They're the only 2 providers, and they were scaled for their demand forecast, and that's all they were scaled for. When all of this missile production kicked back in, first of all, it's going to take them a couple of years to add to what they already have to get the production up. But we decided we need to have a third in this country. Our company did, because we weren't going to get funded by the government to do it, because there's no line item for that in the budget. So I got with Phoebe Novakovic and said, let's try to team up on this. They've got a plant, I think it's Arkansas, where we could actually do final assembly. We have product centers in Lockheed Martin where we could build some of the key components, and we teamed up to create a third provider. And we're going to design the system. We're going to build some components. General Dynamics is going to team up with us to do the assembly and test of the product. And then you'll have a third supplier. But that was just the initiative of a couple of the companies in the space. Unfunded, no order book, by the way. Now, we have an order book for Gimlers and HIMARS and all that, but we just know we're going to need to do this, and we just took a risk investment up front, hoping that it plays out. Yeah. But that's an anti-fragility approach. Let's just make a third supplier before we know we need it, because someday we're going to need it.
So we have some questions coming in from the audience. How do we reduce the risk of adversary access to commercial space capabilities for things like targeting without stifling innovation?
Well, that's a great question. There are a number of places today where I'm concerned about how data is shared. And listen, the foundation of what we need as a nation to make sure that we're able to maintain an advantage is really based on data. And that's why our adversaries want to get access to data. Now, the good news is the United States military generates more data than anybody else on the face of the earth. The challenge for us is, how do we make sure that we use the data in real time? Because much of it is stored. Much of it says, well, we gather all this data, we're going to put it over here, we'll figure out what to do with it later, instead of saying, no, let's really fine-tune our sensors so we understand exactly what data we can use at the speed of relevance. How do we annotate that in ways to make sure that it is not perishable, because data that's been stored and you come back to months or sometimes years later really isn't pertinent? That's what our adversaries want to get. They want to get that access to that data, because they know that gives them an advantage, not only in what they understand about what we do in our technology, but it also helps them advance the development of their own technology. If you look at what happens with software development, if you look at what happens with digital twin technology, where you can learn really at the speed of relevance, it's all based on data. So we have to do a better job of not only protecting our data, but we have to figure out, what do we need to protect? Because we generate so much of it, sometimes the enterprise to protect it becomes so massive, it's like, well, maybe we ought to take a step back and figure out, what is it that we need? How do we refine our sensors to where we're collecting exactly what we need? And how do we use that at the speed of relevance? I think those things are incredibly important in the discussion about how we go forward in this nation, because the data that we have at hand comes to us through the conduit of our satellite technology. And that's going to be the key, whether it's targeting solutions, whether it's targeting data sets. And listen, our COCOMs every day go to work and said, here, what are my targets? What are the targeting solution sets? How do I get that information back and forth? How do I make sure it's in real time? I mean, all of those things are incredibly important. And the enterprise has to be managed in a comprehensive, holistic approach, not just in pieces. And sometimes we get sort of fragmented and only manage it in pieces. And it's because there are multiple jurisdictions there. We can do better at that. And listen, we have a built-in advantage. We collect a ton of data. We have the best sensors in the world, probably more data than anybody else. We just have to do a better job in getting it in a form that can be used at the speed of relevance.
Does anyone else have thoughts on this question?
Yeah, I'll talk a little bit about protecting data.
Well, I mean, I think the real question is how do we prevent the commercial companies from sharing, targeting data with our adversaries?
Yeah.
We work really closely with our commercial companies to protect data over denied areas that we don't want them to take pictures over, military installations, for example. We also work contracting language that says during times of crisis or conflict, I may ask you to do a denial of service to some or all of your customers. And then during times of crisis or conflict, if it really gets to be a really bad day, I can always go to the Defense Production Act and shut that company down. So we have ways and mechanisms. During times of steady state peace, it is a threat, though. The adversary is looking at the commercial data to understand what's going on in CONUS and can reverse engineer that data to do targeting. That is a threat that we are constantly trying to monitor. Derek?
Yeah, the key thing also is to think about, you know, there are needs for commercial transport of data and government transport of data, and they're two separate, right? So the same data pipe that is carrying your Netflix data that you're using for morale, welfare, and recreation type comm is probably not the same thing that you want to make sure is bringing the data directly to go down to a shooter in an F-35 or something. And so that's kind of how we look at it. We have a tactical data link backbone, and that's what we call the proliferated warfighter space architecture. That SDA is building that out, and that is a secret network in space that is tied for this tactical low latency direct connection to shooters and make sure that that's robust and protected. And then we have MilNet, which is more of an extension of kind of a commercial backbone that is tied to say we've got to move a lot of bandwidth data for comms and various aspects, but it might not be as critical, time critical as making sure that we can shoot based on that data immediately. And so you have that level.
Okay, we have another question here. How can the U.S. industrial base be leveraged to combat weaknesses from sole source supply chains for critical defense technologies?
Well, I think it goes back to the anti-fragility concept. We have to identify where those vulnerable points are and then see if we can qualify a second source. Another way of getting to this is using international capital that wants to get involved in some of these arenas, especially space, because their governments and their companies will actually put in the factory, hire the people, do the training program, and the U.S. or the U.S. contractor or company doesn't have to do all of it.
Right.
And then you get better interoperability with your key allies, like we're working with Australia, the U.K., Germany, for example, and Poland on a number of these things. Yeah. So why not leverage and diversify our supply chain, especially our vulnerable single supplier situations, with our best allies and partners? Yeah.
I'll give a specific example about how we've done that at Space Development Agency. So Space Development Agency is a terrible misnomer because we don't do a lot of development. I always say that, we focus on delivery, we should be Space Delivery Agency, but we want to take commoditized components and produce those rapidly. So that means that we don't concentrate a lot on developing new technology. Where we have are where we've identified these critical components. The biggest one that causes a lot of headaches, because there is a single source that's approved through NSA, and that is our mesh network crypto devices. There's really only one supplier right now that we have for that. So we're working to set in, we have contracts in place to get other suppliers in place and go through the NSA certification for that, because we're a firm believer the only way the SDA model works is if we have multiple performers, multiple competition, and bring the entire market base up. And even if we do that at the tier 1 prime level, but we're stuck because there's this one component that there's only one provider of, that's an area that we see as risky, and that's where we invest. Otherwise, we don't really invest in technology.
Congressman, you look like you had thoughts on this.
Yeah, listen, as Derek talked about, the proliferated warfighter space architecture is another example about how critical components or delayed. And when they were, instead of September of this year, it'll be probably April of next year. A critical capability that we need that is impeded by perturbations in the supply chain. So the question is how do you find that sweet spot? How do you make sure you send the proper demand signal? How do you get industry, as Jim said, to make the proper investments? You don't want to overcapitalize there, though, because in this time of utilization of resources, and how do you find that sweet spot? As SDA goes down the road and develops these new programs, that's that learning curve for us to get to the point to say, this is where we can exist to make sure we have the depth in the supply chain. Jim, as you talked about, having more than just 2 suppliers of solid rocket engines, having multiple suppliers of being able to write software, multiple suppliers of the hardware that go into these constellations. That's where we need to create that depth in the supply chain. And the only way you create the depth is to make sure there's a constant demand signal. You can't just say, we want to buy a dozen of these this year, and then next year, we don't want to buy any. I mean, the industry is going to go, well, the heck with that. We're not interested in that kind of business. So consistency and demand signal is key.
Yeah. What you pointed to, Congressman, is really important because when people talk about the traditional defense industrial base, it's 5 companies and some of our suppliers. Even those suppliers for us, almost all of them, their revenue split is 80 to 95% commercial, right, and 5 to 20% military DoD business. If there's only a 1-year contract at a time, guess where those executives and boards are going to invest their capital and their best talent, their inventory? It's going to be on the commercial side. Right. So this multi-year contracting, it's another anti-fragility measure. Yeah. Frankly, I think I told this story to a couple of you today. China itself securitizes long-term military contracts of up to 10 years from the PLA to AVIC or another state-owned company that goes to the Bank of China and gets a loan using the global capital markets at a very low interest rate to set up that whole system.
Yes.
They're using the West money, in a sense, to finance the buildup of their military. Yeah. We don't need to do exactly copying them, but we do want to get private capital into our system, and a good way to do that is to have long-term contracts backed by the U.S. government, which can be securitized or financed on Wall Street. Yeah. We're missing out on one of our other best resources and talents in this country, which is finance, the finance industry.
That sounds like a problem for Congress.
It is. Well, listen, Congress needs to make sure we're consistent in sending the demand signal. The reason there's been perturbations is because people go, well, wait a minute, Congress 1 year does this and next year they don't. Or Congress, for now 19 years in a row, has done CRs. So here we are, we're going to be again into next year with another continuing resolution. And everybody here on this panel knows if you were to come up with a way not to run a government and not to run a business, what would you come up with? A continuing resolution. So you can't do that and expect that there's going to be an evenness in how we respond to these threats and an evenness in how we execute programs and an evenness about how demand is signaled to the industry and about how things are done. This is the roller coaster ride. Here's a bunch of money and a CR. Think about this. So let's say we get appropriations bills done in March. So now you have consumed how many months? Almost 5 months of a 12-month cycle, and then you're going to put all this money in there and tell the agencies, by the way, execute 12 months worth of money in 7 months. You cannot do that efficiently, and it results in a massive waste of money. And the Chinese sit back and go, wow, that's themselves, impeding what needs to happen in this nation and providing the strategic and tactical capability we need to do these important functions of the nation.
I want to take a little bit. We got 2.5 minutes left. I'm going to take a little bit of a sidestep to another topic because I'd be remiss if I didn't, Jim, with you on stage, and that is F-35. It's been getting some attention, even some criticism publicly from those associated with the incoming administration, Elon Musk making comments on X a couple of weeks ago. It raises a key point, I think, more broadly, looking across DoD and what the military needs, and it is this notion of bigger ticket, very sophisticated, maybe perhaps more exquisite systems, and balancing that versus maybe more commoditized, low cost, dual use, fastly acquired systems as well, and what the right mix is. So I just want to get your response to some of the public comments we've heard on F-35, especially as it was a success story just a couple of months ago in Israel with the counterstrikes on Iran.
So it goes back to multiple options and redundancy, having different approaches that an adversary cannot, with one fell swoop, take out your entire mission capability. Yeah. So, and you have to have a time scale to this, right? Drones are absolutely going to be part of the future of the air dominance app or the air dominance mission, but we have to methodically step through where we are at time zero. What aircraft do we have today? What command and control systems do we have today? What missiles do we have today? What does the potential adversary have, and how are they using it? And step forward and bringing in that technology. I'm pretty sure that a $25,000 drone will have no effect on a Chinese J-20 jet. When you see 400 J-20s coming across the Taiwan Strait, you better have 200 NGADs or F-35s or F-22s to meet them, or you will lose, and you will lose right away. And the Israelis did demonstrate this in one of their missions, which was precision strike. Yeah. They used, they didn't say, the Israeli government has not said what aircraft they used, but an ally that was involved in it, one of their senior officials said it was fifth generation. If you add fifth generation in the same sentence as Israel, you can come to your own conclusion. Yeah. And that mission is so successful, it basically eliminated the sophisticated Iranian air defense system and a number of very specialized targets to take out their entire ballistic missile production system without losing a single airplane. I mean, this is an amazing demonstration of where this technology is. We can augment this technology, and we are, and this is public so I can say it, but we demonstrated to the Secretary of the Air Force about 2 months ago in a classified setting, and a month before that in an unclassified setting, that we can right now have an F-35, pilot has a knee board with a tablet on it, just like you've probably got in your briefcase, and he or she can control 8 collaborative combat aircraft off an iPad while still flying the jet and do it effectively. Yep. And we had the Assistant Secretary of the Air Force in the simulator doing it in front of all of us. So this is an available technology right now. These kind of capabilities exist today. That's the earliest exposure that we can even talk about this stuff. Yeah. And if you were to go up the hill to Palmdale and you had the right clearance and can get in the room, it would be what we like to say in the Air Force is eye-watering. Yeah. And most people on the outside of that very small group of people, and Congressman Whitman is one of those people that can know about these things, just need to become aware of where we're at today and how we can incorporate even smaller drones and swarms into the mission while we don't ever give ourselves a period of vulnerability to get there. Right.
All right.
Real quick, can I add one thing to that? Because
Sure.
a lot of people think that SDA and proliferation is saying that we can do everything in that. I just want you to take away this one tidbit. World War II, 2 technologies allowed us to win that war. Liberty ships and the Manhattan Project. You needed them both. And I think that there is that continues to be. You need to have the proliferated mass, and you need to have the exquisite. And you need to just determine what that mix looks like. You can't just have one or the other.
Yeah, exactly.
All right.
It's
Gentlemen,
a combination of all.
we are out of time, but I think that's a good place to leave it.
Morgan,
Thank you
you
so much for
Thank
joining
you.
me on stage.
Thank you.